Hello, my lovely. I am very excited today about our episode because we are going to be talking about avoidant attachment. And I love talking about this stuff because I know avoidant attachment very well, perhaps a little too well. But I am very excited to kind of unpack more about this often misunderstood attachment style and help you to identify why you might be finding things in your relationship a struggle, why you might be feeling disconnected in your relationships, or why sometimes your relationships can feel superficial or just have these other kind of challenges and you think, I don't know where these challenges are coming from. I don't know why relationships feel so hard. I don't know why it's so difficult. And you might be the person who has the traits of avoidant attachment, or you might be listening to this and be in a relationship or be connected to somebody who has avoidant traits. And so if that is you, you are going to learn a little bit more about this relational pattern so that you can pick up on these signs and you can really know that it's not all in your head. You are not imagining it. There are these relationship dynamics happening, and if you are not aware of when they are happening, they can make for very difficult, very challenging relationships. And so we need to know this stuff in order to be able to heal ourselves and to also just have better relationships and have better communication in our relationships so that we can feel connected in our relationships and we can have relationships that feel reciprocal and feel safe and soothing to our nervous systems, and to not keep repeating toxic relationships of the past, or perhaps repeating the same toxic kind of patterns that you pick up from your parents in your relationships. That is what we are unpacking in today's episode. Let's get started. Welcome to Healing Childhood Trauma, the podcast for millennial women who are ready to heal from the past. Here, we have the deeper discussions on emotional well-being and practical tips that will empower you to transform your relationships and underlying anxiety from insecure to secure attachment. I'm Lizandra, your host and psychotherapist. I'm a little bit obsessed with human development, deep conversations, and finding the lesson even in the most challenging of circumstances. I'm very happy to have you with me on this journey of self-discovery where we unpack the past and heal in the present. Relationship struggles and difficult patterns in relationships often comes down to attachment. Just to give you a very quick overview, in case you don't know or in case you are new to the concept of attachment in relationships, it is basically describing the kind of patterns that we form in our earliest relationships. So it's the type of relationship patterns that we form as a result of our childhood experiences and relationships with our caregivers. So being mum, dad, family of origin. I have already recorded an episode on the 4 different types of attachment styles in relationships. You might want to listen to that before you listen to this episode, or you can listen to it after, but this will help to give you a little bit more context as to what I'm talking about, because in that episode, I go into a lot more detail about what attachment is, where it stems from, and the 4 different types of attachment patterns that you can get. In this particular episode, I am just focusing on the avoidant attachment style. And there are actually 2 different types of avoidant attachment style. There is the dismissive avoidant, and then there is also the fearful avoidant. For this particular episode, I am just going to be focusing on the dismissive avoidant, and I'm just going to be honing in on that form of attachment style for now. And I'll probably cover the fearful avoidant style in a different episode. I might touch on it and reference it from time to time, but I'm not deep diving on that part of attachment. That's what's going to help you to have a deeper understanding of this subject and know how it relates to you and your relationships and your own personal experiences. I don't know if there's any official statistics on this, but people who have an anxious attachment style are more likely to go to therapy than people who have an avoidant attachment style. And that has a lot to do with what I will talk about today. And I don't know if there's, like I said, I don't know if there's an official statistic on this. There probably is if I researched it. I didn't research it. I'm just going by my own clinical practice, right? And so what I have seen is that the majority of clients who come into therapy relating to relationship issues and attachment difficulties are more likely to have an anxious attachment style because they're also more attuned and they're more in touch with the difficulty that they experience in their relationships. They're more aware, they're more self-aware a lot of the time because they're hyper-focused on what makes them anxious. And the reason why people with more of an avoidant attachment style tend to not come to therapy as often, and this probably is a generalization, but like I said, I am basing this off of what has been my practice and what I have seen with my clients, is that it takes a longer time. It's a longer process for somebody with an avoidant attachment to even have the self-awareness to think, oh, this is a problem that I need to address, because avoidantly attached people are really good at, you've guessed it, avoidance, right? So they're avoiding dealing with the issue. They're avoiding dealing with emotions. They're avoiding dealing with the fact that they might just be part of the problem. And so that's why, because that pattern of avoidance isn't just about relationships, it can be avoidance in a lot of different areas, but specifically with a dismissive avoidant. Look, I'm getting into the patterns already. Okay, so let me just slow my roll. Let me slow my roll and stick to the bullet points that I've got written down here, because I'm going to get carried away and I'm going to go off in a tangent and like freestyle and just talk all this stuff about attachment. And so let me just like focus my brain for a second. If you are a dismissive avoidant, you do not like to feel needed. Where that comes from is, in your childhood, you've probably had experiences where your needs were not sufficiently met. So whether that is your physical needs or your emotional needs, you had to figure out things on your own because the parents weren't consistent enough for you to get your needs met. And so as your way of coping, you developed a strong sense of not needing to rely on anyone for anything. So instead of feeling anxious about your parents not having consistency and expressing that, you almost minimize that feeling. You internalize it and you almost stuff it down and figure out, okay, how do I resolve this on my own so that I don't need this other person, so that I don't need to have support? How can I support myself so that I cannot be abandoned? Because the root of the fear, the root of the anxiety that people experience as a result of having abandonment wounds and developing an avoidant attachment is that they don't want to feel the feeling of abandonment. They fear that feeling. What is quite similar in an avoidant attachment and an anxious attachment is that you both have experiences of not having your needs met, but the way that you then internalize that is very different. The anxious person becomes more anxious and it shows in their behavior and in the way that they react and respond to things. With avoidant attachment, the internal process is still happening, so the anxiety is actually still there. And if you were to, I don't know, put a heart rate monitor on, for example, and have the same kind of experience, you too would also feel that same level of anxiety. But what you become better at is stuffing those emotions, repressing those emotions so that it looks like on the outside, you're fine. On the inside, you're probably still very anxious. You're still having that threat response happening within your body. But on the outside, you use that to be overproductive. You use that to focus on things that are practical, and you remove yourself from things that feel emotionally charged. Because tapping into the emotion again feels like vulnerability. And when you are a dismissive avoidant, you don't do vulnerability. Vulnerability is not your bag, okay? That is the thing that you avoid at all costs. You avoid anything to do with emotion. You avoid getting hurt because it's self-protection. And so in a relationship, you do not like to feel needed because you don't need anyone. And it irritates you because you're like, why do you need all this stuff? I don't need this shit. Why do you need it? I get on with it. You fucking get on with it. Right? Does that mentality make sense? That is where the avoidant attachment is coming from. And feeling needed feels overwhelming. They need to have that distance in order for them to have that perceived feeling of safety. That's what helps them to feel calm. to have that distance. That's number one. This list is not exhaustive, by the way, but I'm just numbering it just to make it easy for you to be able to follow. So if you want to refer back and pause anything, you kind of know what number we've done. So that's number one. Number two is that you are very sensitive to rejection. And the thing is, nobody loves rejection, okay? But it seems that dismissive avoidants have a particular sensitivity to it because, again, it threatens their sense of self and it threatens their identity. And that feels like a major fight or flight response. The underlying thing that avoidantly attached people are trying to not experience is that feeling of abandonment. And so if you are being critical towards them, or you are trying to explain why they're not good enough at something or why they've done something wrong, they are hypersensitive to experiencing abandonment, and they go out of their way to not have to experience it. So it doesn't make them want to draw closer to you. If anything, it makes them want to distance themselves and pull away because they're trying to avoid that feeling of abandonment. And then number three is that when you have a dismissive avoidant attachment style, you tend to be very emotionally distant in your relationships and even in your friendships as well. This is not just related to your romantic relationships, but it's looking at relationships as a whole. And what you might find, particularly in your friendships, is that your relationships are not very deep. They're quite superficial. And that's because you might be the friend that people come to when they need support, and you might be able to be there for your friends. You might be able to, hold space for them. You might be able to problem solve for them. You might be the person that they go to if they need something. You'll drop everything and you'll be there. You'll show up. You'll do what needs to be done. But if the role is reversed, you ain't asking those same friends for help. Those same friends that think that they know you very well, when they actually think about it, they don't actually have much of an emotional connection with you because you are not that emotionally connected with people in your relationships. You tend to try and keep a distance because that's actually what feels safer to you. It feels safer to almost keep people at an arm's length so that they don't get to know you too deeply. Because if they know you too deeply, there's more potential, again, for you to experience abandonment. And that is the ultimate thing that you are trying to avoid. You are trying to escape feeling that horrible feeling of abandonment that literally feels like life and death. And it might sound like an exaggeration, but that's why sometimes people's reactions and responses are so extreme of, why is their behavior so, it might even be out of character to the type of person that they are. It's because that feeling of threat can feel so real and so powerful if you're not tuned into it and why it's there and when it shows up. It can have you showing some very wild, problematic behaviours. And so the emotional distance, it might not seem very apparent at first because in a romantic relationship, it can look like in the early stages that everything is fine and that they like emotional connection. Those early stages can feel like amazing. But when the relationship starts to take a turn into being more serious and where more vulnerability is needed over a longer period of time, that is when the avoidant traits will come out and you will start to either notice or feel that distance of them pulling away from you, not responding to you as much, not being as emotionally connected because they've reached a point where that abandonment fear has been triggered. And then number 4, dismissive avoidance can also lack self-awareness. And this can be for a number of reasons. One of the things that I tend to see is that they don't perceive vulnerability as a strength. They perceive it as a weakness. And that can be through certain messages that they've received in their childhood of, don't cry, don't show emotion, or just being in an environment where no one talks about feelings, no one talks about emotions. Everybody kind of keeps things under the surface and there's just a lot of passive aggressiveness. And what else? Avoidance. Nobody is talking about the things that matter. People are there for a good time. They're not there for a hard time. You can lack self-awareness because that ties in directly and is completely on brand for being avoidant, because you're avoiding emotions as well. So you're avoiding connection essentially. And so you can end up avoiding that connection in your relationships, but it also starts with that relationship with you. And so you have a lack of self-awareness because you're not connected to being in touch with your emotions. Because again, you have this perception that emotions or being connected to your emotions is a sign of weakness instead of a sign of strength. You perceive it as something that makes you a weaker person. It's somebody that makes you a more vulnerable person. And so if you avoid dealing with feelings and dealing with emotions, then you never run the risk of being hurt. And that's why it often takes a lot for a person who is avoidantly attached to come to therapy, because it takes a lot to have that self-awareness and to realize how sometimes you are contributing to the problems in your relationships. And quite often it can take, in fact, losing that relationship before you understand how your patterns and how your previous childhood traumas or previous childhood experiences, you don't even necessarily have to name them as traumas per se, but for sure your previous childhood experiences impact you as an adult and how you then do relationships and how you show up in your relationships and how you understand yourself. And then number 5 of the dismissive avoidant is that you prefer to be alone. You are a lone wolf. You figure shit out on your own. You don't really need that support from other people. If you do ask for support, it's very rare and it takes a lot before you get to that point. You prefer to just do things on your own, because when you do it by yourself, it gets done. If you kind of rely on somebody else, it doesn't really happen in the way that you want it to. And so if you deal with things on your own, you don't have to then deal with the disappointment of not getting your needs met. And with being a dismissive avoidant, you've learned how to cope and become very self-sufficient. And when you are self-sufficient, you don't really need anybody else, or you think you don't need anybody else, because you don't prioritize connection in relationships. You don't see the value of connection in your relationships because you've had to figure things out on your own. And so you have the mindset and the belief that you can do life alone. You don't need to have relationships. Even though as humans, we are relational beings and we survive in groups. That's literally what being human is all about. It is all about connections. It is all about belonging and being in community. And quite often when you have an avoidant attachment style, you deny that part of yourself because it's a safety seeking behavior. And then number 6 kind of ties into all of what I've said already, which is that you can appear to be emotionally distant. And the thing is, if you are emotionally distant with your own emotions and you repress your own emotions, it's going to make it really difficult for you to be emotionally present for other people. So if you're not having that self-awareness and if you're not connected to your own internal emotional experiencing, you can't really provide that for somebody else. And so it can mean that you can feel and look and seem very cold to the people in your relationships. It can mean that the people closest to you feel like they don't even matter because you are so self-focused. You're not thinking about how things might impact somebody else, because that's just not the way that your brain is wired. Your brain is wired for focusing on you. And that's not a good thing, because you can lose your relationships as a result of being very self-focused and not having emotional connection. We need emotional connection in order for our relationships to grow and in order for us to feel that connection, in order for us to feel loved in relationships. And so that can often be the reason why you end up alone. And I'm not just talking about in the romantic relationship sense, because we don't just find meaning in romantic relationships. In fact, I think that's just a bonus. We don't find meaning out of romantic relationships. We find meaning through different types of relationships, friendships, the relationship that we have with ourselves. And so all of this avoidance isn't just about avoiding romantic connection, it's also avoiding a part of yourself. So that kind of sums up some of the key aspects of dismissive avoidant attachment and what you might be experiencing as somebody who is on the side of dismissive avoidant attachment, or as the person who is in a relationship or a friendship or a situationship with somebody who has a dismissive avoidant attachment style. But these traits are not an entire personality style. They're not your whole personality. They're not the whole being of a person. I kind of want to just put it out there that we're human and we are very nuanced. And so, yes, I can kind of break it down into these categories, but humans are more relational than just these categories. We're on a spectrum of experiences. There's different points in our lives where these traits will come out more than others. There are different types of relationships that can also bring out more of these traits. There's different types of situations that can bring these traits up into the surface. So I don't want you to label anybody or yourself with, this is just who I am, this is just what they do, or if they do this, then that means that. Like, we need to have a little bit more, a bit more depth and a little bit more understanding that, yes, we can categorize certain things, but we are more than just a category. If you are enjoying the episode so far, I would love it if you could leave me a review and rate the show and subscribe so that you are aware of when the next episode is dropping. Okay, I have loved talking about this with you today, and I could talk about it all day, but I'm not going to, because you got shit to do, I got shit to do, and we can talk about it more in other episodes. Talk to you soon. Thank you for joining this episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. Remember, healing is a journey and you are not alone on this path. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. And you can share this episode with a friend. Your feedback helps this podcast to reach more women who are ready to heal and build secure, healthy relationships and heal from the past.